We've had amendments on education of $35 billion. We've had health savings amendments that'll benefit average for income of $112,000, $8 billion. We've had those kinds of amendments. And we're looking at the Kyle Amendment at $3 billion. But we still cannot get a $2.15 over 2 years. Over 2 years. What is the price? We ask the other side. What is the price that you want from these working men and women? What cost? How much more do we have to give to the private sector and the business? How many $1 billion more are you asking? Are you requiring? When does the greed stop? We ask the other side. That's the question, and that's the issue, Mr. President. Make no mistake about it. They have, on the Republican side, 70 more amendments. 70 more amendments. We have none. We're prepared to vote now.
Why is Ted Kennedy so crossed here? Some of my younger audience may not be familiar with Ted Kennedy, but why on earth is Ted Kennedy so pissed off? Ted Kennedy is pissed off because he and the other Democrats wanted to give a $2 raise. They talked about bills in the billions. And when it came to a $2 raise, the Republicans just came up with one amendment after the next to try to slow down and inhibit the legislation. The Democrats' plan that they're trying to push will ban chokeholds, no-knock warrants, lower the threshold for prosecuting officers, limit officer immunity from prosecution, and establish a national database of police misconduct. Now, Trump seems to be on board for the database for police misconduct. He seems to be on board for the no chokeholds thing. As for the no-knock warrants, who knows? And as for lowering the threshold, that's probably a non-starter for Trump, who is trying to protect cops and then basically made a law and order speech. If you get rid of the immunity for cops, then that becomes a little bit less than performative, which is not necessarily something Trump wants to do. Trump is going to get maybe 3% or 4% of the black vote. If he gets 5 or 6, he is overperforming. He gives 2 shits about Black Lives Matter. And the only reason he put out that performative gesture was because 80-something% of the public agreed with the protesters. He is losing in the polls. He is losing the argument for COVID-19. And yeah, he's losing the argument in the context of the protesters. Even the jobs he is going to ultimately get blamed for. But there was a fight that took place between Louisiana's Cedric Richmond and Florida's Matt Gaetz on this very specific issue, and doing and pushing laws that would benefit that community. And I would argue the community as a whole, because it's not like they're going to say no chokeholds for only blacks. It's going to be for everybody. We are basically taking the hit for the rest of the country and doing the legwork for the rest of the country. Yes, it's intersectional. You have all sorts of people who are out there. But the fight that we're having, where it's getting kind of ensconced as if it's a black issue, really does apply to the whole nation. The key point here, though, is this will not work. I told you, the performative win that they're trying to give, it's only a mirage. The goal of it is not necessarily to give you the type of win that you would need in order to eliminate the problem. I'll explain what I mean. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamal Thomas. This is Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, and subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. This content is brought to you by you, and I appreciate the opportunity for allowing me to do it. Now, this has been trending. And this has been trending because this has been a wild argument that these two had. Despite the fact that it's been a wild argument, despite the fact that I suppose that the gentleman feels strongly about what he is talking about on both sides of it, the offense and the commentary dealing with that generated the offense. So I don't necessarily entirely want to call it performative. I mean, some of these provisions, all of these are actually really good ideas in regards to provisions. My issue with this is its sole focus is on the cops, which means this will not ultimately work. We want the cops to be cuddlier. We want to give them cats and dogs to make them less insane when they're going out doing their job. In communities that are dirt poor, you will still continue to incentivize the over-policing. You will still continue to incentivize the crime. And beyond incentivizing the crime and incentivizing the over-policing, because the police are going basically to the places where the crime is, it is a well-established understanding that even though it is not determinative, there are certain outcomes for poverty. Kids tend to end up in poverty when they're in poverty. Kids tend to end up dropping out of school at a higher rate. They tend to have higher rates of absenteeism. They tend to have higher rates of brain or growth and learning disabilities. There tend to be larger share of disease like heart disease or tooth decay. Those things are interrelated with one another, or diabetes for that matter. These are economically driven outcomes from our poor community. More importantly, violent crime, and property crime. Now, the property crime is an inverse relationship. Basically, if you're in a poor community, well, stealing from somebody else who's poor doesn't really get you anywhere because they're already poor. So this theft often comes in nearby neighborhoods of people that are wealthy. Violent crime has a direct relationship to income inequality. The higher the income inequality, the higher the violent crime. This is the point that I'm telling you here, and this is why I so focus on this, because it needs to be understood that one-side equation is not going to work. Cops are there entirely for the issue of crime. It doesn't even make sense to have a cop in that situation, meaning the edifice, the device that is a cop does not make any sense in an area of safety and security. It only makes sense in the absence of those things. The racists jumped into the Republican Party. And that's entirely, don't misunderstand me, and I'm talking about overt. You have people like Joe Biden who said black folks can't raise their kids, and in no way would understand how racist that statement is. But in this very specific case, after the Civil Rights Movement, after the Voting Rights Act, those guys jumped into the party. What did Lyndon LBJ say? We lost the South for a generation. LBJ was right. In this very specific case, that South, who's representing the moneyed class and, let's say, the elements that like this notion of policing, especially in the context of policing black bodies, Gates interrupts. And these two get into a fight like nobody's business over this issue. And like I said, the bill is going to get through the House Judiciary, in which case they're probably going to end up with a full vote. But they've been trying to slow this down to the degree that they can slow it down. And at this point, Cedric Richmond is not having it. Let's do the clip. Play it out.
Chief, I'm not even interested in studying the Klan or sovereign citizens right now, because that is not the imminent threat that black men face on a daily basis. And right now, too often, it is law enforcement, those who were sworn to protect and to serve. And so all we're asking today is to deal with that. I don't mind dealing with other pieces of legislation. I don't mind dealing with other issues that you all may have. And what I don't want to leave this conversation with, and why I'm speaking now instead of later, is because I don't want you all to leave here saying, well, we didn't know. We didn't know that's how you felt, Cedric. I want it to be crystal clear, and I will give you the benefit of the doubt that it is an unconscious bias that I'm hearing, because at worst it's conscious bias, and that I would hate to assume from any of the people on the other side.
Will the gentleman yield?
Sure.
I appreciate your passion. Are you suggesting that you're certain that none of us have non-white children? because you reflected on your black son and you said none of us could understand.
Man, stop. I'm not about to get sidetracked about the color of our children. We're talking about black kids. I reclaimed my time.
You said that
I reclaimed my time. I know.
You want the discussion?
I know that
Gentleman reclaimed his time.
I said I reclaimed my time. I already know that there are people on the other side that have black grandchildren. It is not about the color of your kids. It is about black males, black people in the streets that are getting killed. And if one of them happens to be your kid, I'm concerned about him too. And clearly I'm more concerned about him than you are. So let's be clear about that.
You're claiming you're more concerned for my family than I do? Who in the hell do you think you are?
If the shoe fits.
You don't know how much we care about our families.
Kick dog holler.
You should take those words down. I know you care about your family and love your family.
The gentleman will suspend. The gentleman will suspend. The time belongs to the gentleman from Louisiana. Cedric,
if I'm making an argument that people in the African American community are being murdered by cops, and you can show one video after the next, you can point to one picture after the next, you can even point to the statistics that show that the interactions, particularly around the notion of violence, tends to be higher. Now, even the murder rate, I mean, like, especially for if you're looking from state to state, some of these states have just insane levels where cops kill African Americans. Cops is just one of those things. You have heart disease, kidney failure, diabetes, a 3-to-1 death rate with COVID-19, a lower lifespan, an appalling infant mortality rate. I mean, those are horrible things in and of themselves, in addition to the cops. This is kind of why I get to the point of saying dealing with poverty deals a broad spectrum of issues. Putting a cop in a situation is not going to stop crime. Cops are only reactive to crime. So it's not an issue of safety and security at that point. It's just an issue of a strong man with a gun trying to scare criminals and taking criminals to jail after the fact. You must understand, crime is a rational act. If it wasn't, people wouldn't do it. Crime is a rational act. What do you want? You want to go hungry? You want to get a job making minimum wage where you're one of those people making $18,000 a year? Do you want to get a job where you don't have any agency in that process, living in substandard homes and whatnot? Or do you want to take actions that will bring in money in the house even though it's illegal? Again, from the standpoint of a family that has the things that they need, the incentive for crime goes down. If you don't have the things that you need money for food, clothing, shelter, pay for a kid, pay for a house, pay for whatever your bills are, then the issue of crime becomes less of a bad gamble. It becomes a cost-benefit analysis. And in that particular cost-benefit analysis, the thought is, I may not get caught, and I'll get the money and the resources that I need to pay for myself. There's a secondary factor to this of status. Your country decides that money is not just a resource to be used to buy something, but it's also a resource to be used as a status symbol. Well, in doing so, you have other members of the society who is in a situation of lack of the degree to which they lack. And issues of violent crime go up and is commensurate with income inequality. Meaning, the higher the level of income inequality, the higher the level of violent crime. This has to do with this notion of people feeling on some gut level that this level of difference between who you are versus who I am and the economic status between those two things, it digs into them at a gut level, which they believe creates social tension, which continues or drives crime. You're barking up the wrong tree. And I suspect you guys are barking up the wrong tree intentionally because you don't want to deal with the main issue. It is well established at this point that issues of poverty incentivize crime, absenteeism. You can go down the list. I think I read the list earlier. But those things, if you know that, and you know that because you believe in science, then it is somewhat appalling to have a conversation where you completely wipe off one side of the equation. You're basically are going to send cops or mental health workers into dirt poor communities where the level of crime that the cop is dealing with hasn't diminished, hasn't changed one iota. And that cop is going in, supposedly, is not going to use that chokehold, is not going to use that weapon. It's not. I'm just doubtful that this would do what you want it to do without getting rid of the incendiary, not incendiary, the instigating factor of needing these guys. That's all. One last point. Frame of reference. These conversations are always weird in its frame of reference to me. If I say a middle class to rich community had, I don't know, let's say if you had a crime figure going from 0 to 100, and I say it had a crime figure of 20. And then I show you somewhere in Chicago that has a crime figure of like 80, and I ask the basic question: if Chicago or that particular area was leveled up in regards to jobs, healthcare, security, etc., would the crime rate resemble the other state? I think the answer would be yes, by definition. If we're saying that this particular state, based on the statistics of this particular state, taking into account the poverty measure and everything else, has a poverty measure of 35, let's go with Vermont. And then you look at some other one that's crime-ridden, and you say, okay, this one has a much higher. If you change those dynamics, if you ensure that that particular population is made whole, that that particular population is thriving, that that particular population and the people of that population have the things that they need in a sense of human growth and development, meaning they're not drinking lead water, they're eating nutritious foods, and they go to school to get an education when they want the education without debts of their back. You know, scientifically, that there are grossly negative outcomes that could be avoided by ending and dealing with those rough edges. And you don't do anything about it. And you just kind of make a bill where you're talking about one side of it. You don't get applause for that. It's almost like you're intentionally skewing and not having that conversation. How weird is it that capitalism is taking off the table when you're having this conversation? When you had Klobuchar, the rich guy, who basically said that if Nancy Pelosi says that thing about income inequality again, he's close his purse strings. When you're talking about issues of concentrated wealth, FDR comes into mind, where concentrated wealth is basically like organized money is basically no different than organized mob. But understand what that means for democracy. Jeff Bezos has $1 trillion. Political leverage and influence of somebody like Bezos, if he decides to use that money for political intent, it will be vast. And I would point out that the reason you don't have Medicare for all, the reason you don't have elimination of student debt, the reason you don't have free public colleges and universities, the reason you haven't had an expansion of Social Security, or for that matter, a wealth tax, is because the bias and the perspective of the people that are in the political class are in the capitalist mindset. They love markets. They're neo-libs. They're getting money from people who are basically shoving money in their pockets in order to do political policy. And part and parcel to those policies is not to do the things that I just named. Those things will be popular to the public. Those things will dramatically benefit the health, happiness, well-being of the public. But that matters less. Which gets me back to the weird point that I'm talking about. They presuppose every solution is in a situation where the capitalist system is raping the public blind. And they never challenge the fact that maybe the issue is that the capitalist system is raping the public blind. I'll end this here. Like, share, and of course,